She boarded for 2 weeks. She says she was kept there for 12 years. The ship was called Freewinds. From the outside, it did not look like a prison. It looked like a religious retreat at sea. A white ship moving through the Caribbean, connected to the Church of Scientology, described by the church as a spiritual environment, a place for advanced religious training, and the exclusive location for one of Scientology's highest levels. But for Valeska Paris, the ship meant something very different. She says she was sent there in 1996, when she was around 18 years old, after being told it would only be a short assignment. 2 weeks. That was the promise. But according to her account, those 2 weeks became years. She says her passport was controlled. She says she could not leave the ship independently for the first 6 years. She says her contact with family was controlled, her desire to leave was treated as a disciplinary problem, and the ship's beautiful Caribbean surroundings became part of the trap. But this case has to be told carefully. No criminal court has declared that Valeska Paris was kidnapped, imprisoned, or trafficked. The Church of Scientology denies her allegations. It says her presence and work were voluntary religious service. And yet, her story did not disappear. In 2011, she went public. A former senior Freewinds executive, Ramona Dienes Browning, supported major parts of her account. Then, in 2022, Valeska and other former Sea Org members filed a federal forced labor and trafficking lawsuit. That lawsuit has not produced a final public ruling on whether her allegations are true. Instead, the case became trapped in another system: religious arbitration. So the question is not only whether a ship can hold someone. The darker question is this: how can an adult be on a ship that docks at public ports and still believe she cannot leave? Before Valeska Paris became connected to the Freewinds, she had already spent most of her life inside Scientology's world. According to the public account, she was Swiss-born and raised in a Scientology family. This matters because her story does not begin with an adult woman making one isolated decision to join a ship. It begins much earlier, inside a system she says shaped her understanding of family, loyalty, discipline, and obedience. When she was still a child, Valeska's family moved into the environment of St. Hill, Scientology's headquarters in the United Kingdom. She was reportedly placed in the Cadet Org, the children's division connected to the Sea Organization world. That detail is important, because by the time she was a teenager, Scientology was not just a religion she had heard about. It was the world around her. At age 14, she reportedly joined the Sea Organization, or Sea Org, the religious order of Scientology. Members sign what is known as a symbolic billion-year commitment. They live communally, use maritime-style ranks and uniforms, and perform assignments connected to church operations. To the church, Sea Org work is voluntary religious service. To some former members, including Valeska, the reality felt very different. They describe a system where childhood conditioning, family pressure, discipline, financial dependence, and fear of disconnection made leaving feel almost impossible. That is why Valeska's childhood matters to the story. If you only begin with the ship, the audience may ask a simple question: why didn't she just walk away? But if you begin with her upbringing, the question becomes more complicated. What does choice mean when a person has grown up inside one closed world? What does voluntary mean when your family, housing, work, identity, and spiritual future are all tied to the same organization? Later court filings included allegations that, by age 15, Valeska was already performing long days of work at Scientology's flag base in Clearwater, Florida. Those filings described duties like food preparation, laundry, office cleaning, and personal assistant tasks for senior executives. But those are allegations, not final court findings. Still, they help explain the world Valeska says she came from. A childhood shaped by discipline. A teenage life inside Sea Org. A family conflict that would later become central. According to reporting, Valeska's mother publicly spoke against Scientology after the suicide of Valeska's stepfather, Albert Jacquier. Valeska says she was told her mother had attacked the church, that her mother was considered a suppressive person, and that Valeska had to disconnect from her. That alleged family break becomes one of the emotional engines of the story. Because this is not only about a ship. It is about a young woman who says she was separated from her mother, placed into a religious maritime system, and then sent to a vessel where the normal world felt very far away. By the time Valeska was sent to the Freewinds, she was around 18. Legally, she was an adult. But according to her account, she had never really lived as an independent adult outside Scientology. She did not describe herself as someone freely choosing a Caribbean assignment. She described herself as someone being sent. And once she boarded the ship, the outside world became harder to reach. The Freewinds was not a normal cruise ship. That is the first thing to understand. Passengers were not booking ordinary vacations on it the way they would book a commercial cruise liner. The Church of Scientology describes the Freewinds as its flagship service organization, an advanced religious retreat, and the exclusive location where one of Scientology's highest spiritual levels, New OT8, is delivered. In official descriptions, the ship is around 440 feet long, based in the Caribbean, with Curaçao as its home port. It has operated as a Scientology religious retreat since 1988, and it is staffed by Sea organization members. That makes the setting unusual. It is a ship, but also a religious facility. A workplace, but also a spiritual environment. A vessel that moves through the Caribbean, but also a closed community where staff and members live under church structure. To the church, this is a positive and distraction-free environment for religious service. To Valeska Paris, it became something else entirely. She says the ship's isolation was not freedom. She says it was control. That contrast is the heart of the episode. From the outside, the Freewinds could look peaceful. A ship in warm water. Caribbean ports. A religious retreat away from the noise of ordinary life. But isolation can work two ways. For one person, isolation means focus. For another, it means there is nowhere to go. On land, leaving an organization might be difficult emotionally, socially, or financially. But on a ship, the difficulty becomes physical too. You are surrounded by water. You are moving between foreign ports. Your housing is on board. Your work is on board. Your supervisors are on board. Your documents, according to Valeska's allegation, may not be freely in your hands. That is why the ship matters. The Freewinds was not just a background location. It was part of the alleged system. Valeska says that once she was on the ship, her movement was controlled. She says she could not leave independently during the first 6 years. She says her passport was held by ship officials. She says she had limited money, limited outside support, and limited ability to build an independent life in foreign ports. The church denies those claims. It says she was not forced, that the escort restriction claim is false, and that life on the Freewinds was voluntary religious service. So the documentary has to hold both facts at once. Valeska's allegation, the church's denial, and the reality that no criminal court has resolved this as kidnapping or trafficking. That is what makes the case legally sensitive, but also powerful. Because the question is not a simple locked-door question. There is no strong public evidence that Valeska was continuously held in a locked cabin or physical cell. The stronger story is about alleged coercive control. A system where the door may physically exist, but the person inside believes leaving would cost them everything. Family, religion, identity, shelter, community, documents, purpose, and maybe even the idea of being a good person. That is why the Freewinds is so important to Nautical Noir. It is not a ghost ship. It is not a murder scene. It is not a drug vessel. It is a ship where one woman says the line between religious service and captivity disappeared. According to Valeska Paris, the assignment was supposed to be short. Around September 1996, she says she was given only a few hours' notice and told she was being sent to the Freewinds for a 2-week assignment. At the time, she was around 18 years old enough on paper to be considered an adult. But according to her account, not free in any meaningful way. She said the assignment did not feel like a choice. It felt like an order from the organization she had grown up inside. 2 weeks. That is the number that makes the story so haunting. Because a 2-week assignment sounds temporary. You can endure almost anything for 2 weeks. A difficult room. A hard supervisor. Long hours. A job you do not like. A separation from family. You tell yourself there is an end date. But Valeska says that end date never came. The assignment stretched. Then stretched again. Years began to pass. The public version of her story often says she was held on the Freewinds for 12 years. That phrase is powerful, but it needs careful handling. Valeska publicly described the period as 12 years. But the available date-based timeline places her ship assignment roughly from 1996 until 2007, which is about 11 years. Court records also indicate that she left the Freewinds and signed an arbitration agreement in 2007. That discrepancy should not be hidden. It should be explained. People often describe long periods in rounded or inclusive terms. The broader period of control may also have felt longer than the strict calendar years aboard the ship. But for accuracy, the documentary should say, she publicly described it as 12 years, although the available dates place her aboard from roughly 1996 to 2007, about 11 years. That kind of honesty makes the episode stronger, because the core claim does not depend on perfect rounding. Even 11 years is staggering. A 2-week assignment becoming more than a decade is already enough. During those years, Valeska says the ship became the center of her life. Work, discipline, religious structure, supervisors, and limited contact with the outside world all existed around the same vessel. She also says the first 6 years were the most controlled in terms of movement. According to her account, she could not go ashore without an escort. This is another detail that must be handled carefully. The accurate claim is not that she never left the ship at all for 12 years. The accurate claim is that she says she could not leave independently for the first 6 years. That difference matters, because exaggeration gives critics an easy way to dismiss the whole story. The real version is already disturbing enough. A young woman says she was sent to a ship for 2 weeks. She says her movement was controlled. She says her passport was controlled. She says her mother had been cut off from her life. And she says it took more than a decade before she finally left that ship through an organizational transfer. Not by jumping overboard. Not by secretly escaping in a port. Not through a dramatic movie scene. In 2007, she was transferred to Australia. Later, in 2009, she left the Sea Org and Scientology entirely. The 2-week assignment had become the central chapter of her life. And when she finally told the story publicly, the question was not simply how long she was on the ship. The question was how an assignment could become a life. The most important question in the Valeska Paris case is also the question many viewers will ask first. If the ship docked at public ports, why didn't she just leave? That question sounds simple. But Valeska's account is about a form of control that she says was not based only on locked doors. It was based on a system. According to her, one of the first barriers was her passport. She says that after she arrived on the Freewinds, passports were controlled by ship management. Without a passport, leaving a ship in a foreign Caribbean port is not simple. You cannot easily travel, identify yourself, cross borders, book flights, or start a new life if your documents are not in your hands. But again, the wording matters. The public record does not show a passport custody receipt or port authority document proving confiscation. So the safe line is, Paris says ship officials controlled her passport. Not. Records prove they confiscated it. The second barrier was shore leave. Valeska told ABC that during her first 6 years aboard the Freewinds, she could not leave the ship without an escort. That is a serious allegation, because it changes the meaning of a docked ship. If you can only step onto land while monitored, then land does not really mean freedom. But the church denies this claim and says the escort allegation is completely false. That denial needs to be included clearly. The third barrier was family. Valeska says her mother had been labeled or treated as an enemy of the church after speaking out against Scientology. She says she was told she had to disconnect from her mother. If true, that would mean one of the most important outside lifelines had been cut. That kind of separation can make a person feel alone even when they are surrounded by people. The fourth barrier was financial dependence. Valeska had grown up inside the organization. She says she had limited money, limited independent work history outside the church, and no normal adult foundation beyond Scientology's world. If someone does not have money, documents, housing, or outside contacts, the idea of walking away becomes much harder than it sounds. The fifth barrier was discipline. Valeska's account suggests that wanting to leave was treated as a moral or spiritual problem. Inside a high-control environment, leaving can be framed as betrayal, failure, or danger. that can make the door feel closed even when no one is physically standing in front of it. This is why the phrase floating prison has to be used carefully. There is no public proof that Valeska was continuously locked in a cabin or held behind bars. Her claim is more complex. She describes psychological, institutional, religious, logistical, and financial control. A ship in the Caribbean. A controlled passport. Escorted shore leave. Family disconnection. Discipline. Long labor. Limited independence. And a life shaped since childhood by one organization. The church says her work was voluntary religious service, and that Sea Org members receive housing, meals, uniforms, medical support, transport, and personal allowance. Valeska and other former members say that what the church calls voluntary service did not feel meaningfully voluntary under those conditions. That is the central conflict. Not whether a door had a lock, but whether a person can be so controlled by a system that leaving no longer feels possible. The most disturbing part of Valeska Paris's account involves the engine room. She alleged that at one point she was assigned to work there for approximately 48 hours, almost continuously. According to her, the environment was extremely hot, loud, dirty, and physically exhausting. She said she was alone, that sleep was extremely limited, and that at one point she became unconscious or fell asleep for several hours before another worker found and woke her. It is a brutal image. A young woman aboard a religious ship in the Caribbean. Not on the deck. Not in a peaceful retreat space. But deep in the mechanical heat of the vessel. Working for hours in a place designed for machinery, not rest. But this detail also has to be framed carefully. The church denies that Valeska was forced to do engine room labor. And the public investigation file does not show engine room duty sheets, medical reports, or independent documents verifying that specific 48-hour assignment. So the script should not present it as a court-proven fact. It should present it as Valeska's allegation. What gives her story more weight is that she was not the only former Freewinds figure to speak out. ABC also interviewed Romana Dianes-Browning, a former senior executive on the Freewinds. Romana said that Valeska did not want to be on the ship, that she was distressed over separation from her mother, and that her assignment did not seem genuinely voluntary. Romana described the situation as imprisonment. That corroboration matters. Romana was not just a random viewer commenting from the outside. She had been inside the same world. She had senior experience aboard the ship. And her account supported major parts of Valeska's story. But even here, the documentary must stay balanced. Romana was not a neutral law enforcement investigator. She was also a former member with her own allegations of coercion, trauma, and difficulty leaving. The church denied Romana's claims as well. That is what makes this case difficult and compelling. You have one woman's detailed public account. You have another former executive supporting major parts of it. You have the church's denial. You have no criminal conviction. And years later, you have a federal civil lawsuit alleging forced labor and trafficking. The lawsuit was filed in 2022 by Valeska Paris, Gawain Baxter, and Laura Baxter. They alleged that they had been brought into a coercive system from childhood, that unpaid labor was obtained from them, and that Scientology-linked defendants benefited from that labor. But a lawsuit is not a final ruling. Court records summarize the allegations, but the court has not publicly decided the merits. That means the engine room remains one of the darkest alleged scenes in the story. Not because a court has fully proven it, but because it captures the central accusation. That a ship presented as a spiritual retreat may have also been, for some people inside it, a place of labor, punishment, and control. Valeska Paris went public in 2011. That was the year Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Lateline aired an investigation by Steve Canane. The report included Valeska's detailed interview, her childhood history, the Freewinds assignment, passport and escort allegations, the engine room claim, Romana's corroboration, and the church's denial. From that point on, her story existed publicly. But public exposure did not mean legal resolution. There is no public record showing that Valeska's allegations led to a criminal conviction for kidnapping, false imprisonment, forced labor, passport seizure, or trafficking. So the case should not be framed as a crime authorities proved. It should be framed as an allegation that later became part of a federal forced labor and trafficking lawsuit. That lawsuit was filed in April 2022. Valeska Paris, Gawain Baxter, and Laura Baxter sued David Miscavige and multiple Scientology-linked entities, including the flagship service organization connected to the Freewinds. They brought claims under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, alleging that they had been brought into a coercive system from childhood, made to perform years of unpaid labor, and that the defendants benefited financially from that labor. The church-linked defendants denied the allegations. And then the case moved into the legal question that now defines the aftermath. Arbitration. Court records say Valeska had signed agreements in 2007 when she left the Freewinds, and another release around 2009, both containing religious arbitration language. Valeska's side argued that these agreements were signed under coercive circumstances or duress. The defendants argued that the arbitration agreements were valid and enforceable. In March 2023, the federal judge ruled that the defendants could enforce the arbitration agreements. The case was not dismissed on the merits. Instead, it was stayed while arbitration proceeded. The judge ruled that certain challenges, including duress and fraud, had to be addressed by the arbitrator under existing law. That means the public court did not decide whether Valeska had been trafficked. It did not decide whether she had been imprisoned. It did not decide whether her forced labor allegations were true. It decided where the dispute had to go first. In 2024, the plaintiffs sought reconsideration based on a newer Supreme Court arbitration decision. The district court denied that motion and maintained the arbitration order. By 2026, the dispute was still not finished in public court. Former members argued that the arbitration process was unfair and asked for the stay to be lifted. The judge refused to lift the stay before arbitration concluded. So the current public status remains unresolved. The civil allegations have not been finally proven or rejected in public court. The case is stayed while the parties fight over religious arbitration. And that is why the legal ending feels so strange. Valeska says a ship became the place she could not leave. Years later, her lawsuit entered another closed system. Not at sea this time, but behind the doors of arbitration. In the end, the Freewinds kept sailing. The Caribbean waters stayed blue. The ship continued to represent something holy and peaceful to the people who believed in its mission. But for Valeska Paris, the image was different. She says she boarded for 2 weeks. She says she stayed for years. She says her passport was controlled, her shore leave was monitored, her family contact was cut, and her desire to leave was treated as a problem inside the system that had raised her. The Church of Scientology denies those allegations. No criminal court has declared that she was kidnapped, imprisoned, or trafficked. And the civil lawsuit that brought her claims into federal court has not yet produced a final public answer on the merits. That is what makes this case so haunting. It does not end with a body. It does not end with a rescue boat. It does not end with police storming the ship. It ends with a harder question. What does freedom mean if a person believes leaving will cost them everything? Valeska eventually left the Freewinds through an organizational transfer in 2007. She later left the Sea Org and Scientology entirely in 2009. Then she spoke publicly. Then she sued. Then the case moved into arbitration. And still, the larger question remains. Was the door open? Or had the system around it made the door impossible to use? That is the darkness at the center of the Freewinds story. A ship can dock at public ports. A person can physically see land. The ocean can be calm. The sky can be clear. And still, according to Valeska Paris, the outside world can feel unreachable. Not because of chains. Not because of bars. But because control does not always look like a locked room. Sometimes it looks like a passport you do not hold. A family you are told to disconnect from. A belief system you have known since childhood. A job you cannot leave. A ship that keeps moving. And a life where the door is there, but freedom is not.